Imagine sitting on a plane, ready to take off, when suddenly a loud argument erupts just a few rows behind you. The tension is palpable, the voice is sharp, and everyone's heads turn to see what's going on. This wasn't just any argument. It was a moment that would change lives forever. A flight attendant, seemingly in control, was yelling at a young black girl over a simple seat assignment. The girl, no older than 16, looked visibly shaken, her voice trembling as she tried to explain her side of the story. But the flight attendant wasn't having it. Her tone was harsh, her words cutting, and the entire cabin fell silent, unsure of what to do. What started as a routine flight quickly turned into a scene that no one on board would ever forget. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get any more intense, something shocking happened. 2 minutes later, the flight attendant was fired, right there on the spot. How did things escalate so quickly? Who was this young girl, and why did this seemingly small issue lead to such a dramatic outcome? This is a story about power, prejudice, and the unexpected twists that can happen when people stand up for what's right. But it's also a story that's far from over. As the plane sat on the tarmac, passengers whispering among themselves, one question lingered in the air. What happens next? The young girl, let's call her Maya, had boarded the plane with her family, excited for a vacation they'd been planning for months. She was polite, soft-spoken, and had a smile that could light up a room. But when she reached her assigned seat, she found someone else sitting there. Confused, she politely pointed out the mix-up, but the passenger refused to move, claiming it was their seat. Maya, not wanting to cause a scene, decided to find a flight attendant to help sort it out. That's when things took a turn. The flight attendant, a woman in her late 40s with a reputation for being strict, approached Maya with an attitude that immediately put everyone on edge. Instead of calmly resolving the issue, she began berating Maya, accusing her of trying to cause trouble. Maya's family tried to intervene, but the flight attendant only grew more aggressive, her voice rising with every word. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, some recording the incident on their phones, while others looked away, unsure of how to help. But then, something unexpected happened. A man sitting a few rows back stood up. He was tall, with a commanding presence, and his voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Enough," he said firmly, addressing the flight attendant. "This is unacceptable." The cabin fell silent as he introduced himself. He was an off-duty airline executive, and he had seen enough. Without hesitation, he pulled out his phone and made a call. 2 minutes later, the flight attendant was handed a piece of paper and escorted off the plane. The look on her face was a mix of shock and disbelief, but no one on board felt sorry for her. Maya, still shaken, was offered a first-class seat as an apology, but the damage had already been done. As the plane finally took off, the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken questions. Who was this executive, and why did he step in? What would happen to the flight attendant after this very public firing? And most importantly, how would Maya and her family move forward after such a traumatic experience? This story is far from over. It's a reminder that even in the most ordinary moments, life can take an extraordinary turn. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable, and the ripple effects that one moment of courage can create. But as the plane soared through the clouds, one thing was clear. This was just the beginning. What happens next will leave you speechless. Stay tuned as the plane climbed higher into the sky. The cabin remained eerily quiet. The usual hum of conversation was replaced by the occasional whisper, the rustle of snack bags, and the faint sound of someone's headphones leaking music. But everyone's minds were still on what had just happened. Maya sat in her new first-class seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her parents, seated beside her, exchanged worried glances. They were relieved that the situation had been resolved, but the way it had unfolded left a bitter taste in their mouths. Maya's younger brother, who had been watching everything with wide eyes, finally broke the silence. "Why was she so mean to you?" he asked, his voice small and confused. Maya didn't have an answer. She replayed the scene in her head, trying to make sense of it. Was it really just about a seat? Or was there something deeper at play? Meanwhile, the off-duty airline executive who had stepped in sat a few rows behind them. His name was David Carter, and he was a high-ranking official in the company. He had been flying under the radar, hoping to enjoy a quiet trip to visit his family. But when he saw the way the flight attendant was treating Maya, he knew he couldn't stay silent. David had spent years working his way up in the airline industry, and he had seen his fair share of conflicts. But this was different. The flight attendant's behavior wasn't just unprofessional, it was deeply troubling. As he sat there, scrolling through his phone, he couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was just the tip of the iceberg. What if this wasn't the first time something like this had happened? What if there were other passengers who had been treated unfairly but never had the chance to speak up? David made a mental note to look into the flight attendant's record. As soon as he landed, something told him this wasn't going to be an easy case to close. Back in the main cabin, the passengers were slowly starting to relax. A few people struck up quiet conversations, trying to distract themselves from the tension that still hung in the air. One woman, who had been sitting near Maya during the argument, leaned over to her friend and said, "Did you see how that flight attendant was talking to her? It was like she had it out for her from the start." Her friend nodded, her expression serious. "I know. It didn't feel right. I mean, it's just a seat. Why make such a big deal about it?" The two women exchanged knowing looks. They didn't say it out loud, but they were both thinking the same thing. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about something much bigger. As the flight continued, Maya's parents tried to comfort her. Her mom reached over and took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Maya nodded, but her eyes were still clouded with emotion. "I just don't get it," she said quietly. "I didn't do anything wrong. Why did she have to yell at me like that?" Her dad, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. "Sometimes people act out because of their own issues," he said carefully. "It's not about you, Maya. It's about them." Maya knew. He was trying to make her feel better, but his words didn't fully ease the sting of what had happened. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had been targeted, and it left her with a sinking feeling in her stomach. Meanwhile, the flight crew was doing their best to carry on as if nothing had happened. The remaining flight attendants moved through the cabin with forced smiles, offering drinks and snacks to passengers. But their usual cheerfulness was noticeably absent. It was clear that they were shaken by what had happened too. One of the younger flight attendants, a woman named Sarah, kept glancing toward the front of the plane where Maya was sitting. She had been working with the fired flight attendant for over a year, and she had always found her to be strict but fair. But what she had just witnessed was something else entirely. Sarah couldn't help but wonder if there had been signs she had missed. Had her coworker always been this way, or had something changed? She made a mental note to talk to the other crew members once they landed. Maybe they had noticed something too. As the plane began its descent, the tension in the cabin started to lift slightly. Passengers began gathering their belongings, chatting about their plans for when they landed. But for Maya and her family, the ordeal was far from over. They knew that once they stepped off the plane, they would have to decide what to do next. Should they file a formal complaint? Should they let it go and try to move on? Maya's parents were torn. On one hand, they didn't want to make things harder for their daughter. But on the other hand, they felt a responsibility to speak up, not just for Maya, but for anyone else who might have experienced something similar. When the plane finally touched down, the passengers erupted into applause, a tradition on some flights, but this time it felt different. It was as if they were celebrating not just the safe landing, but the fact that they had made it through a flight that had been anything but ordinary. As they filed off the plane, many of them glanced at Maya, their expressions a mix of sympathy and curiosity. Maya kept her eyes down, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. She just wanted to get out of there. But as she stepped into the terminal, she was met with a surprise. David Carter was waiting for her. He introduced himself and apologized again for what had happened. "I want you to know that this isn't the end of it," he said firmly. "We're going to look into this, and we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again." Maya nodded, unsure of what to say. She appreciated his words, but she couldn't help but wonder what looking into it really meant. Would anything actually change? Or was this just another empty promise? As Maya and her family made their way to baggage claim, they were approached by a reporter. Somehow, word of the incident had already gotten out, and the media was eager to hear their side of the story. Maya's parents exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't expected this. Should they talk to the press? Or would that only make things worse? Before they could decide, David stepped in again, politely but firmly telling the reporter that now wasn't the time. "This family has been through enough," he said. "Give them some space." The reporter reluctantly backed off, but it was clear that this story was far from over. By the time they reached their hotel, Maya was exhausted. All she wanted to do was curl up in bed and forget about the day. But as she lay there, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The flight attendant's harsh words echoed in her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about her. It was about something much bigger, something that went beyond a simple seat assignment. And as she drifted off to sleep, one thought kept circling in her mind. What happens next? The next morning, Maya woke up to find that the story had gone viral. Videos of the incident had been shared thousands of times, and people were already taking sides. Some were outraged on Maya's behalf, calling for the airline to take action. Others defended the flight attendant, claiming that there must be more to the story. Maya's parents were overwhelmed by the attention, but they knew they couldn't stay silent. They decided to hold a press conference to share their side of the story. But as they prepared to speak, they couldn't help but wonder, would anyone really listen? Or would this just be another story that fades away as soon as the next big thing comes along? Meanwhile, David Carter was back at work, digging into the flight attendant's record. What he found shocked him. There were multiple complaints from passengers and coworkers alike, all describing similar behavior. But for some reason, nothing had ever been done about it. David knew he had to take this higher up the chain, but he also knew it wouldn't be easy. The airline had a reputation to protect, and not everyone would be happy about him stirring the pot. As he sat in his office, staring at the stack of files in front of him, he couldn't help but wonder, was he about to uncover something much bigger than he had bargained for? The story was far from over, and the stakes were higher than anyone could have imagined. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about a seat assignment anymore. It was about justice, accountability, and the power of standing up for what's right. And as the world watched, waiting to see what would happen next, one question remained. Who would have the courage to see this through to the end? As the sun rose the next morning, Maya's family found themselves at the center of a storm they never could have anticipated. The press conference they had decided to hold was set to take place in just a few hours, and the hotel lobby was already buzzing with reporters and camera crews. Maya sat in the corner, her knees pulled up to her chest, scrolling through her phone. The comments on the videos of the incident were a mix of support and vitriol. Some people called her brave for standing her ground, while others accused her of exaggerating or even lying. Her heart sank as she read one particularly harsh comment. "She's just looking for attention." She closed the app and took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. This wasn't how she had imagined her vacation starting. Her parents were in the middle of a heated discussion with David Carter, who had offered to help them navigate the media frenzy. "We need to be careful about what we say," David warned. "The airline is already under a lot of pressure, and they're going to be looking for any way to spin this in their favor." Maya's dad crossed his arms, his expression stern. "We're not going to let them sweep this under the rug," he said firmly. "This isn't just about Maya. It's about making sure no one else has to go through something like this." David nodded, but his face was tense. He knew this was going to be an uphill battle. Meanwhile, across town, the fired flight attendant, Linda, was sitting in her small apartment, staring at her phone in disbelief. The video of her confrontation with Maya had gone viral, and her inbox was flooded with angry messages. Some were from strangers, calling her every name in the book, while others were from former coworkers, expressing their shock and disappointment. Linda felt like the walls were closing in. She had always prided herself on being a no-nonsense professional, but now her entire career was in ruins. She picked up the phone and dialed a number, her hands shaking. "I need a lawyer," she said as soon as the call connected. "This is getting out of hand." Back at the hotel, the press conference was about to begin. Maya's family stood behind a podium, flanked by David and a few other airline representatives. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras clicking and flashing as Maya's dad began to speak. He recounted what had happened on the plane, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "No one should ever be treated the way my daughter was treated," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "This isn't just about one flight attendant. It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked." The room erupted into questions, but Maya's dad held up a hand. "We're not here to answer questions today," he said firmly. "We're here to demand accountability." As the press conference wrapped up, David pulled Maya's parents aside. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "There's something you should know." He led them to a private room and closed the door behind them. "I've been looking into Linda's record," he began, his voice low. "And it's not good. There are multiple complaints against her, but for some reason, they were never addressed." Maya's mom frowned. "Why not?" she asked. David hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It's complicated," he said, "but it seems like there might have been some favoritism involved. Someone higher up may have been protecting her." The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. This wasn't just about one bad employee. It was about a culture of silence and complicity. While all of this was happening, Sarah, the young flight attendant who had been on the plane with Linda, was meeting with a group of her coworkers at a nearby cafe. They had all seen the video, and they were all struggling to make sense of it. "I just can't believe it," one of them said, shaking her head. "I mean, I knew Linda could be tough, but this is something else." Sarah nodded, her expression troubled. "I keep thinking about all the times I saw her being harsh with passengers," she said quietly. "I always told myself it was just her way, but now I'm not so sure." The group fell silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts. They all knew that speaking up could cost them their jobs, but they also knew they couldn't stay silent forever. As the day wore on, the story continued to gain traction online. Hashtags like hashtag Justice for Maya and hashtag Airline Accountability began trending, and people from all over the world were sharing their own stories of mistreatment by airline staff. It was clear that this was no longer just about one incident. It was about a much larger issue. Maya's family was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support, but they also knew that the fight was far from over. The airline had yet to issue a formal statement, and there were rumors that they were preparing to push back hard. That evening, Maya sat by the hotel window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Her mind was racing, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. She thought about Linda, wondering what had driven her to act the way she did. Was it just a bad day? Or was there something deeper going on? She thought about David and the way he had stepped in to help. Was he really on their side? Or was he just trying to protect the airline's reputation? And then there were the passengers on the plane. The ones who had recorded the incident, the ones who had whispered among themselves, the ones who had stayed silent. What were they thinking now? Did they regret not speaking up sooner? As she sat there, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from an unknown number. "Stay strong," it read. "You're not alone." Maya stared at the screen, her heart pounding. Who had sent this? And how had they gotten her number? She showed the message to her parents, who exchanged worried glances. "We need to be careful," her mom said softly. "This is getting bigger than we thought." Maya nodded, but she couldn't help feeling a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something bigger. Maybe this was her chance to make a difference. But as she closed her eyes that night, one thought kept nagging at her. What happens next? The airline was still silent. Linda was lawyering up, and the public was watching closely. The stakes were higher than ever, and the tension was building. Whatever was coming, Maya knew it wasn't going to be easy. But she also knew she couldn't back down now. This was about more than just a seat assignment. It was about justice, accountability, and the power of standing up for what's right. And as she drifted off to sleep, she made herself a promise. No matter what happened, she wouldn't give up. Not now. Not ever. The story was far from over, and the world was watching. But one thing was clear. This was just the beginning.